Caleb Rowe walked out of Blackthorn Industries with his employee badge cut in half, 6 weeks of wages frozen, and his dignity shredded in front of the entire executive floor by a woman who had never once set foot on the factory line she claimed to run. Vivian Blackthorn believed a single father drowning in debt would stay quiet to protect his daughter. She was wrong. Caleb walked out carrying something far more dangerous than anger. He carried copies of every report she had forced him to falsify. 3 days later, an emergency board meeting was called. Vivienne walked in ready to bury him for good, and froze the moment she saw an empty chair pulled out across the table, waiting for him. If you believe in quiet justice over loud revenge, stay with this story until the very end, because what Caleb Rowe does next will change how you think about power. 3 weeks before that meeting, Caleb was standing on the factory floor at the Hartwell plant with grease on his forearms and a tablet in his hand, watching a production line that had nearly closed its doors twice in 2 years. He had spent 14 months rebuilding it piece by piece, not through miracles but through patience, renegotiated supplier contracts, a revised shift schedule that stopped burning out the second crew, and a habit of walking the floor every morning before the sun was fully up. The men and women who worked those machines trusted him because he showed up, because he asked questions instead of issuing orders, because when something broke, he was usually the first one kneeling beside it with a wrench in his hand. 15 years in operations had taught Caleb Rowe that a factory told the truth long before a spreadsheet did, and Hartwell was finally telling a good one. For the first time in 3 years, the plant was profitable, and word of it had traveled all the way up to corporate. The building itself still smelled the way it always had, hot metal and machine oil, and the faint sweetness of coffee burning too long in the break room pot. But the sound had changed. There was less grinding hesitation in the line now, less of the stop-and-start rhythm that had haunted the plant during its worst quarters, and more of the steady, confident clatter of machines running the way they were built to run. Caleb had learned to read that sound the way other men read a balance sheet, and lately it had been telling him something he had not felt in years, that the people under his care were finally safe in their jobs. He thought about that safety often because he understood better than most how quickly it could be taken away, how a single bad quarter or a single careless decision from someone far above the factory floor could undo 18 months of careful, patient work in a single afternoon. He did not know yet how prophetic that thought would turn out to be. Vivian Blackthorn arrived for the quarterly review with a small entourage of executives trailing behind her, heels clicking against concrete that had never once felt her weight before that morning. She smiled for the cameras that followed her, praised the numbers in the report her assistants had prepared, and grew visibly irritated when floor supervisors kept turning to Caleb instead of to her when questions arose about production timelines. Caleb watched her move through the plant that morning, the way a visitor moves through a museum exhibit, admiring the machinery from a careful distance without ever quite touching it, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether she understood that the numbers she loved so much were made by human hands. In the conference room upstairs, she presented a revenue chart to the corporate board, numbers climbing in a clean green line that made the quarter look like a triumph. Caleb sat near the back and noticed what the chart conveniently left out: the warranty costs from a batch of faulty components, and a wave of returned shipments that had never been logged against the total. He waited until the room thinned before quietly asking Vivian whether the figures might need correcting before they reached the full board. Vivian's expression did not change, but her voice dropped into something colder than the air conditioning. She told him his job was to keep the machines running, not to lecture a chief executive on how to speak to shareholders. Caleb let it go that afternoon, chalking it up to pressure and pride, the kind every leader carried when a company's fortunes rested partly on their shoulders. That evening he drove home to the small house he had kept together since his wife passed, where his daughter Sadie was waiting at the kitchen table with a stack of tuition paperwork spread in front of her like a hand of cards she did not want to play. She told him gently that she could take a semester off if money was tight, that it would not be the end of the world. Caleb told her not to worry, that the bonus for saving Hartwell was coming, that everything would be fine once the paperwork cleared corporate. He believed it completely. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand, the same way he had done since she was small enough to sit on his shoulders during the county fair, and told her that whatever else happened, she was not losing her education over a few slow weeks of paperwork. Sadie smiled the way she always did when she was choosing not to argue with him, though the tightness around her eyes told him she had already done the math on their bank account far more carefully than he had. After she went up to bed, Caleb sat alone at the table for a long while, running his thumb along the edge of a stack of bills he had not yet opened, telling himself the same thing he told his daughter, that the money was coming, that it always came eventually if a man simply did his job well enough. 3 days later, an email arrived summoning him to headquarters, attached to a document listing numbers he knew, with absolute certainty, were false. At the downtown headquarters, Vivian slid the report across a glass conference table and asked Caleb to sign it. The document confirmed that Hartwell had hit every single target for the quarter, no exceptions, no shortfalls, and it quietly placed blame for a string of defective units on the floor workers rather than on the cut-rate components. Corporate procurement had substituted 8 weeks earlier to save money. Vivian promised the signature would unlock his bonus and open the door to a promotion she had been considering for him. Caleb asked instead that the warranty costs be added back into the figures and warned that submitting the report as written could put the company in violation of covenants tied to its bank loans. He watched her tone shift from persuasion to something sharper, something rehearsed. She reminded him, almost casually, of his mortgage payments and of a certain tuition deadline approaching for his daughter, proof that she had studied his life the way a predator studies a trail. Caleb still refused to sign. In front of the assembled executives, Vivian accused him of insubordination, of concealing failures, of endangering the company through his stubbornness. There was no shouting when she fired him on the spot and ordered security to collect his badge before he had even risen from his chair. Nobody in that room raised an objection. The humiliation came quietest from the people who avoided his eyes. Colleagues he had defended in budget meetings for years, now studying their laptops as if the carpet had suddenly become fascinating. When Caleb asked about the 6 weeks of wages still owed to him, along with the bonus that had already been approved in writing, Vivian told him flatly that an employee terminated for serious misconduct forfeited every remaining payment. The paperwork, he noticed, had already been drafted and printed before the meeting even began, which meant none of this had been decided in that room at all. Caleb stood slowly, buttoned his jacket out of some old instinct toward composure, and looked around the table at faces he had known for years, men and women he had covered for during layoffs, defended in budget disputes, driven home more than once when their own cars broke down in the plant parking lot. Not one of them met his eyes. He understood, in that long, silent walk to the elevator, that fear had a way of making decent people small, and he found he could not entirely blame them for it, even as the humiliation settled into his chest like a stone. He left the building without raising his voice, without begging, without giving her the scene she seemed to be waiting for. In the parking garage, a woman named Naomi Price intercepted him near his truck and pressed a folded slip of paper into his palm before hurrying away without a word of explanation. On it, in small, careful handwriting, were 12 words that would not leave his mind for the rest of the night. Your termination date was pushed back 6 weeks. You are not the first. At home that night, Caleb checked his account and confirmed what the note had warned him to expect. Not only had the promised bonus vanished, but 6 full weeks of earned wages were gone from the system entirely, as though he had simply stopped working before the Hartwell turnaround was ever finished. The company's internal records now showed his last active day falling weeks before the plant returned to profitability, which meant, on paper, the recovery he had engineered no longer belonged to him at all. Caleb filed a formal wage complaint through the proper channel and mailed a certified letter to the board's audit committee, resisting the urge to broadcast his humiliation anywhere public. Because he suspected Vivian was waiting for exactly that kind of reckless reaction to justify everything she had already done to him. That night the house felt smaller than usual, the way it always did when bad news moved in and took up space in every room. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed for a long time before he found the words to tell Sadie what had happened, choosing to give her the truth plainly rather than let her hear a softened version of it later from someone else. She listened without interrupting, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and when he finished, she did not cry or panic the way he half expected. She simply asked him what he planned to do about it, and something in the steadiness of her question reminded him powerfully of her mother. Sadie offered to drop out of school for a semester to ease the pressure at home, and for the first time in her life, Caleb did not have a ready answer that made everything sound fine. He told her the truth, gently, that he was not sure they would keep the house if this dragged on much longer, and watched something in her young face harden with a kind of quiet resolve he recognized from her mother. A few days later, Naomi found him at a crowded diner 2 towns over, choosing the noise and anonymity of the lunch rush to avoid being seen together. She told him, in a low voice over cooling coffee, that dozens of other former employees had experienced the same quiet manipulation of their final work dates, robbing them of wages, bonuses, and severance they had already earned honestly. Naomi kept her voice low, her eyes flicking toward the door every few sentences, and Caleb could see how much it cost her to sit across from him at all. She was not a reckless woman, not someone who took chances without weighing them carefully first, and the fact that she had come at all told him how deeply this had troubled her conscience. The money that vanished from those final paychecks, she explained, had been routed into an internal account labeled, without any apparent shame, a leadership continuity fund. Caleb understood immediately what that meant. Vivian was building an executive bonus pool out of wages stolen from the people who had never missed a single shift for her. Naomi did not hand him confidential company files or anything she had no right to share. She gave him only reference numbers for transactions that already carried his own name attached, information she was legally permitted to disclose because it directly concerned him. The very next morning, a letter arrived from the company's legal department, accusing Caleb of misappropriating proprietary documents and threatening formal litigation if he did not return everything immediately. Caleb had prepared carefully for that interview, pressing his one good shirt the night before, and rehearsing answers about the Hartwell turnaround that he had every right to be proud of. And the cancellation landed harder than he expected, a quiet reminder of just how far Vivian's reach extended beyond the walls of her own company. That same week, a promising job interview at another firm was abruptly canceled after the hiring manager mentioned apologetically that she had received an unusual reference check from Blackthorn Industries. Then Harrison Kingsley called him directly. As the board's independent chairman, Harrison invited Caleb to present his concerns to the audit committee in person, but warned him plainly that Vivian already suspected someone inside the boardroom had been quietly reaching out to him. Caleb spent that evening organizing every document he was legally entitled to keep: employment contracts, pay stubs, bonus approval letters, and performance reports he himself had authored and signed. He accessed nothing he was not permitted to see, and copied nothing that belonged exclusively to the company's private systems. From what was already public and legally his, a disturbing pattern began to surface, one that reached far beyond a single unpaid paycheck. Blackthorn Industries had been paying enormous consulting fees to a firm called North Star Process Consulting, a company registered at an address with no functioning office and, as far as Caleb could determine, no actual staff performing any real work. The listed representative for North Star was a man named Duncan Hale, who happened to be Vivian's brother-in-law by marriage. Those consulting fees had climbed sharply at precisely the same moment employee wages across multiple facilities were being quietly delayed or withheld altogether. A board member named Preston Vale requested a private meeting with Caleb at a hotel bar downtown, insisting the board had no interest in letting a scandal damage thousands of working families who depended on the company for their livelihood. Preston offered to return every dollar of Caleb's withheld wages, his full bonus, and a substantial settlement on top of it. The only condition was silence. Caleb would need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, withdraw his formal complaint, and publicly describe his termination as nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. Preston slid the folder across the table with the practiced ease of a man who had closed 100 quiet deals in rooms just like this one, his voice low and reasonable, almost kind. He told Caleb that nobody wanted this to become a public spectacle, least of all the thousands of ordinary workers whose paychecks depended on Blackthorn staying out of the headlines. And for a moment Caleb almost believed the concern was genuine rather than strategic. For one long moment, staring at the number on the settlement offer, Caleb thought about the mortgage payment due in 11 days and nearly reached for the pen sitting on the table between them. Then he noticed a single unfamiliar phrase buried deep in the agreement's confidentiality clause, a reference to something called Project Glasshouse that he had never once heard mentioned in any meeting during his 15 years with the company. When Caleb asked Preston what Project Glasshouse actually was, the older man's face went pale, and he abruptly ended the meeting without answering, confirming without meaning to that this, more than any unpaid wage, was the thing the board truly feared exposing. Caleb refused to sign, fully aware that walking away from that money might cost his family the only home Sadie had ever known. 2 days later, Naomi sent him a photograph of an internal payment authorization tied directly to Project Glasshouse, and the final approving signature on the document belonged unmistakably to Vivian Blackthorn herself. He spent 2 sleepless nights at his kitchen table with nothing but a laptop, a legal pad, and a growing pot of coffee, cross-referencing filings, permit records, and every scrap of publicly available information he could legally gather. Sadie would come downstairs at odd hours and find him there, surrounded by printed pages covered in his own handwriting, and she stopped asking when he planned to sleep because she already knew the answer was not until this made sense. Working only from public filings, and the numbers he already understood better than anyone left at the company, Caleb pieced together what Project Glasshouse truly was. It was a quiet plan to sell off the company's most profitable division, the Advanced Fleet Technology Unit, to an outside investment fund with ties running straight back to the Blackthorn family itself. Vivian was deliberately manufacturing losses across the company, driving down the stock price so that fund could purchase the crown jewel of Blackthorn Industries at a fraction of what it was truly worth. To disguise those engineered losses, she had cut wages, delayed vendor payments for months at a time, and blamed the resulting chaos on plant managers who had never made a single decision behind it. Caleb realized with sudden clarity that firing him had never really been about one falsified quarterly report. He was the only executive left who still held the complete operational plan, proving that division remained profitable, evidence that would collapse her entire justification for selling it cheap. Mara Ellison, the company's chief financial officer, reached him afterward on a personal cell phone number he did not recognize, her voice tight with fear rather than confidence. Her voice trembled at first, the careful professional tone she was known for, cracking under the weight of months of silence, and Caleb found himself listening more than speaking, letting her get through it at her own pace. She admitted that Vivienne had pressured her into signing off on transactions she barely understood, always with the same promise that the full board had already approved everything behind closed doors. Caleb asked for nothing illegal from Mara, only that she appear at the coming board meeting and tell the truth about what she had actually witnessed. Around the same time, Vivienne discovered that Naomi had been reviewing payroll files connected to Caleb's termination and immediately suspended her system access, escorting her out of the building under the watchful eyes of security guards who had once reported directly to her. Before her badge stopped working, Naomi had already printed a full wage reconciliation report as part of her assigned duties and forwarded one copy quietly to the company's legal department. Vivienne then summoned every senior manager into an emergency meeting and announced, with practiced outrage, that Caleb Rowe had stolen confidential trade secrets in an attempt to extort the company for money. She informed the room that police and legal counsel would both be waiting if he ever dared step foot inside headquarters again. Grant Whitaker, the company's general counsel, called Caleb that same evening with news that changed everything. The scheduled board meeting would proceed exactly as planned, and Caleb was formally invited to bring every piece of evidence he had gathered and sit directly across the table from the chief executive who had tried to bury him. The morning of the board meeting arrived gray and quiet, the kind of ordinary weather that seemed almost disrespectful, given what was about to happen inside that glass tower downtown. Caleb had barely slept, running through the order of his evidence again and again in his mind until the sentences blurred together, but standing in front of the mirror that morning, tying his tie with steady hands, he felt something settle in him that had not been there in weeks. He was not walking in to beg for his job back. He was walking in to tell the truth, and whatever happened afterward, that truth would still be true. Caleb arrived at headquarters wearing the same worn gray suit he had bought for his wife's funeral years earlier, carrying a single thin folder that looked almost too modest for the weight it held. Vivienne was already seated with her legal team arranged around her like a small fortress, radiating the calm confidence of a woman who expected the board to treat Caleb as nothing more than a disgruntled former employee with a grudge. Harrison Kingsley opened the meeting by asking every phone in the room to be placed outside the door, a small gesture that nonetheless set an unusually formal tone. Vivienne spoke first, accusing Caleb of sabotaging internal reports, stealing sensitive company data, and quietly cooperating with a rival firm to damage Blackthorn's reputation from the inside. She played a short clip of security footage showing Caleb copying files from a company computer late one evening, and for a moment, several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, doubt creeping visibly across their faces. Caleb calmly explained that the footage had been recorded on the exact date he had backed up his own operational reports as part of a routine annual audit requirement, a task he had been formally instructed to complete in writing months earlier. Grant Whitaker confirmed that Caleb indeed possessed a written directive authorizing precisely that backup, effectively neutralizing the accusation before it could fully land. The room grew very still as he spoke, the kind of silence that comes when people who have spent their careers avoiding direct confrontation suddenly find themselves unable to look away from it. Caleb kept his voice level throughout, resisting the urge to raise it even once, because he understood that the facts alone would carry more weight than any display of anger ever could. Caleb then laid out his evidence piece by piece, beginning with the original Hartwell performance report, followed by the falsified version Vivienne had pressured him to sign, then the internal edit history showing exactly when and how the numbers had changed, and finally the payroll records revealing his wages had been withheld only after he refused to cooperate. Vivienne countered that Caleb had likely altered the records himself out of pure vindictiveness, her voice sharp but controlled. Grant responded by presenting backup data pulled directly from the company's own servers, proving conclusively that every edit request had originated from an account tied specifically to the chief executive's office, not from anywhere near Caleb's department. Naomi was then called into the room to testify, and she confirmed under direct questioning that Caleb's official termination date had been quietly pushed back 6 full weeks, and that at least 43 other former employees had suffered identical manipulation of their own records. Vivienne attempted to redirect the blame toward the Human Resources Department, claiming she had never personally reviewed those individual termination dates. Mara Ellison then walked into the room and placed a printed meeting summary on the table, one clearly documenting Vivienne's own instruction to redirect unpaid employee wages into an executive leadership bonus fund. Preston Vale requested an immediate recess, arguing that the board needed time to think clearly rather than react emotionally to what had just been presented. Harrison agreed to a 10-minute break, and Vivienne, mistaking his caution for continued loyalty, allowed herself a small measure of relief as she stepped into the hallway. When the meeting resumed, an independent auditor brought in by Grant's office confirmed that the electronic signature authorizing Project Glasshouse belonged unmistakably to Vivienne Blackthorne, verified through a digital certificate that could not have been forged or reasonably disputed. The full evidence now showed that Vivienne had used North Star Process Consulting as a channel to quietly siphon company funds while simultaneously preparing to sell the most profitable division of Blackthorne Industries to an investment fund tied directly to her own extended family. Vivienne did not plead for mercy or attempt further denial once the signature was confirmed. Instead, she argued that every decision she had made was necessary to preserve the Blackthorne family legacy through what she called an unforgiving market. She looked at Caleb with open contempt, telling him that a plant manager could never understand the pressures of running an entire corporation. Caleb did not respond with an insult of his own. He simply pointed out in a steady and unhurried voice that she had not been saving the company at all. She had been forcing ordinary employees to absorb losses she manufactured so her own family could quietly buy back the pieces at a discount once the stock collapsed. The board voted immediately to suspend Vivienne from her position, effective that very moment. Preston Vale cast the only vote against her removal, a fact the meeting minutes would record permanently. For a moment, nobody in the room moved, the silence stretching long enough that Caleb could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system somewhere above them. Vivienne's composure did not fully crack, but something behind her eyes shifted, the particular look of a person realizing that the machinery she had built to protect herself had just been turned entirely against her. Her badge was deactivated within minutes, the same swift and clinical procedure she had once used against Caleb without a second thought. Harrison chose not to have security physically remove her from the building. He allowed Vivienne to gather her things and leave under her own power, a small mercy that preserved the difference between justice and cruelty, even in a moment of total defeat. Once she had gone, Harrison turned to the remaining board and stated plainly that the company urgently needed an acting chief executive capable of rebuilding trust among factory workers, suppliers, and the banks that had grown increasingly wary of Blackthorne's finances. The board formally offered that position to Caleb Rowe. He did not accept immediately, even as relief and vindication settled uneasily in his chest. Instead, he laid out 4 conditions before he would agree to take the seat at all. Every dollar of withheld wages had to be repaid in full to every affected employee, without exception. The illegal executive bonus fund had to be dissolved permanently. An independent audit of Project Glasshouse had to move forward without interference from anyone still loyal to Vivienne. And the Hartwell plant, the place where all of this had truly begun, could not be closed as a way to quietly bury the scandal. The board accepted every condition without argument, and Caleb was named acting chief executive for a 90-day probationary term. The chair that had once symbolized Vivienne's untouchable authority now felt to him like a burden far heavier than any triumph. Almost immediately after the vote concluded, the company's primary bank notified Blackthorn Industries that its line of credit was being frozen without warning. Vivienne, in one final act before her departure, had quietly triggered a covenant clause designed to strangle the company financially within 10 days if she ever lost control of it. News of the suspended chief executive sent Blackthorn's stock price tumbling within hours, and several key suppliers began demanding immediate payment on outstanding invoices before agreeing to ship another part. Rumors spread quickly through the factory floors that Caleb was merely a temporary face meant to calm public outrage before the family quietly resumed control behind the scenes. Standing on a makeshift platform in the main warehouse the following morning, looking out over a sea of faces he recognized from a decade of walking factory floors, Caleb felt the full weight of what had just been placed in his hands. These were not shareholders or board members. These were people who had bills of their own, children of their own, mortgages and rent and prescriptions that did not wait for corporate crises to resolve themselves. He called an all-company meeting the following morning, refusing to promise an easy road ahead and refusing just as firmly to present himself as some kind of savior arriving to fix everything overnight. He announced publicly that every withheld paycheck would be repaid in structured installments, starting with the employees who had gone the longest without their money. Caleb also froze his own executive salary at its previous operational level, insisting he would not accept a leadership premium until every worker had been made completely whole. Working closely with Mara Ellison late into several nights, Caleb reviewed the company's cash flow line by line and discovered Blackthorn could survive the crisis if it canceled the fraudulent consulting contracts, sold the company's private aircraft, and suspended executive bonuses entirely for the coming fiscal year. Northstar responded almost instantly with a legal letter demanding millions of dollars in damages for breach of contract the moment its agreement was terminated. Caleb asked Grant to examine the contract's original approval trail, and they discovered it had never actually been ratified through proper board procedure in the first place, rendering Northstar's threat far weaker than it first appeared. Even from outside the building, Vivienne reached out privately to Blackthorn's largest remaining client, warning them that Caleb lacked real executive experience and that the company was likely headed toward bankruptcy within months. That client, spooked by her warning, began preparing to cancel a shipping contract worth tens of millions of dollars, a loss that could have unraveled everything Caleb had built in a matter of days. Rather than hide the turmoil, Caleb chose complete transparency, presenting the client with real production data, an honest delivery timeline, and an open invitation to send their own independent auditor directly into the Hartwell facility. That willingness to be fully seen, rather than managed and spun, ultimately persuaded the client to stay, and the massive contract remained intact through the crisis. Then, buried deep in a scheduling system nobody had thought to check, Caleb discovered something Vivienne had left behind on her way out the door. An automated notice was set to fire at dawn the following Monday, informing 800 employees across 3 facilities that their positions had been eliminated. With less than a single weekend remaining before that notice would fire automatically, Caleb could not simply delete it. since it was tied contractually to bank covenants and vendor agreements already filed with outside parties. He gathered his legal, financial, and operations teams late on a Saturday afternoon, making it clear that no one was obligated to give up their weekend for this. They worked through 2 full nights, fueled by cold pizza and vending machine coffee, spreadsheets glowing on every screen in the room, and somewhere around 3 in the morning on the second night, Caleb realized the exhausted faces around that table looked nothing like the frightened, guarded expressions he had seen in the building only months before. Nearly every senior staff member volunteered without hesitation, many admitting quietly that it was the first time in years they had trusted a leader enough to believe the sacrifice would actually matter. Caleb revived the very recovery plan Vivian had dismissed months earlier as too cautious and too slow. A plan built around canceling every fraudulent consulting agreement, clawing back improper deposits paid to shell companies, liquidating luxury assets purchased by former executives, delaying construction on a lavish new headquarters, and renegotiating payment terms with patient, long-standing suppliers. Together, those measures generated just enough emergency cash flow to cancel the mass termination notice before it could ever reach a single employee's inbox. In the final hours before the deadline, Vivian requested one last private meeting with Caleb, arriving without her usual entourage of lawyers and advisors. She offered him the password to a hidden Project Glasshouse account in exchange for one simple favor: that he tell the remaining board she had merely made a series of poor governance decisions, rather than a deliberate crime. For a moment, sitting across from her without the lawyers and the polished armor of the boardroom, Caleb saw something almost human flicker behind her carefully composed face. A woman who had spent her entire life believing that protecting the family name justified whatever it cost the people beneath her. She reminded him, almost wistfully, that her family had built this entire company from nothing, brick by brick, decades before he had ever walked through its doors. Caleb answered her without cruelty and without hesitation, telling her that building a company gave no one the right to steal from the very people whose labor kept it running long after the founders were gone. He declined her offer completely and forwarded the details of her attempted bargain directly to investigators already reviewing the case. Caleb made no attempt to humiliate Vivian further, issued no public statement condemning her family by name, and made no effort to destroy what remained of her personal life beyond the company. He simply let the evidence speak, and let the law decide whatever consequences would follow from here. Blackthorn Industries cleared its critical payment deadline with hours to spare, steadying just enough for the board to schedule one final vote, the one that would decide who would lead the company permanently. The change did not happen overnight, and Caleb never pretended otherwise to anyone who asked, because the slow rebuilding of trust had taken every one of those 90 days and then some. There were setbacks along the way, vendors who remained wary, a handful of employees who quietly began looking for work elsewhere before deciding to stay, and long nights where Caleb wondered whether the company could truly hold together under the weight of everything it had survived. 90 days after that first chaotic board meeting, Blackthorn Industries had stabilized its supply chain and preserved every single manufacturing facility it once threatened to shutter in panic. 43 former employees received their full back wages, accumulated interest, and additional compensation exactly as required under the settlement Caleb had insisted upon from the very beginning. He, too, finally received his own 6 weeks of withheld wages, along with the recovery bonus that had been dangled and then denied months earlier. Caleb did not refuse the money out of some hollow gesture of nobility, because he understood he had genuinely earned every dollar of it through 15 years of honest work. He used part of that payment to finally settle his mortgage arrears and to pay Sadie's tuition in full for the coming semester. Watching a quiet weight visibly lift from his daughter's shoulders when he told her the news. The company installed an independent payroll oversight system that made it structurally impossible for any single chief executive to unilaterally alter employee termination dates or withhold wages ever again. Naomi was promoted into the company's newly formed internal audit division, earning the position purely on merit rather than any special favor owed for her earlier courage. Mara remained as chief financial officer under considerably closer board supervision, formally answering for the long months she had stayed silent rather than speaking up sooner. Preston Vale resigned from the board entirely once his quiet financial ties to North Star Process Consulting came fully to light in the independent audit's final report. Vivian Blackthorne lost her severance entirely, forfeited every remaining stock option tied to her tenure, and now faces both civil lawsuits and an ongoing financial investigation into Project Glasshouse and the broader pattern of wage theft uncovered beneath it. The board formally offered Caleb the permanent role of chief executive. No longer temporary, no longer conditional on a 90-day trial period. Harrison Kingsley, drafting the final terms himself rather than leaving it to the lawyers, told Caleb privately that he had never seen an executive ask to be held more accountable rather than less. And Caleb simply replied that a chair meant nothing if the person sitting in it could not be trusted with what it held. He accepted, but only after insisting his own contract include a clause allowing the board to remove him immediately if he ever violated employee rights, regardless of how strong the company's quarterly earnings happened to look at the time. On his first official day as permanent chief executive, Caleb did not move into the Grand Corner office Vivienne had once occupied, with its imported marble and its private elevator. He converted that space into a shared conference room open to any employee who needed it, choosing instead a modest office near the operations floor where he could still hear the machines running through the wall. Sadie stopped by after her evening class 1 week later and found the 2 broken halves of his old employee badge sitting quietly in his desk drawer. She turned the 2 broken pieces over in her hands, fitting them back together like a puzzle that could never quite be whole again, and asked him softly why he had kept something so painful so close. He had not framed it as some trophy of triumph, and he had no intention of ever displaying it that way. He kept it simply to remember, on the days ahead when the work grew hard, exactly how it felt to be treated by someone with power as though he were not worth hearing at all. Sadie sat down on the edge of his desk, still holding the 2 broken halves of the badge in her palm, and waited for him to finish, the way she had learned to wait for her father whenever he had something important to say. He told his daughter, quietly and without any performance in his voice, that leadership was never about taking the chair away from someone else. Leadership, he said, was making certain no one who sat in that chair could ever again use it to take an honest paycheck out of someone else's hands. Outside the window behind him, the evening shift was changing over on the factory floor, the familiar rhythm of footsteps and machinery settling into place exactly as it had on the night this all began. Except now every single person clocking in knew their wages were safe, and that alone, Caleb thought, was worth every sleepless night it had taken to get there. Vivienne once believed that 6 weeks of stolen wages would be enough to keep Caleb Rowe silent forever. In the end, those same 6 weeks were exactly what proved to the entire board which one of them had truly deserved to lead Blackthorn Industries all along.